Something in the body reacts before you realize what it's reacting to. A slight tightening, a small shift in posture, an internal pause. It's the familiar preparation that appears whenever the possibility of disappointing your parents crosses your mind. The reaction is fast, almost automatic, as if an old instruction is still running in the background. You feel the pressure before you form the thought. The expectation isn't spoken, yet it shapes your next move. And even as an adult, the body behaves like it's protecting something essential, the connection you learned not to risk. Some reactions begin before you name them. In childhood, the body learns to read the emotional climate around a parent before it understands what that climate means. Approval becomes a signal of safety, and tension becomes something to avoid. A child notices shifts that adults rarely register. A shorter tone, a slower exhale, a distracted expression. These cues create an internal map. Move closer when the parent is open. Stay quiet when the parent withdraws. The pattern forms quickly. Over time, the child stops checking how they feel and instead checks how the parent seems. This switch is subtle. It doesn't feel like obedience. It feels like accuracy, aligning with the emotional landscape that determines whether the moment remains calm. Even small inconsistencies teach something. When praise appears only at certain moments, the child learns to predict those moments. When disappointment arrives quickly, they learn to stay ahead of it. The nervous system begins organizing around these patterns without needing conscious awareness. This calibration becomes the background of later behavior. The child doesn't set out to please the parent, they set out to prevent a shift in the parent's state. Preventing tension feels safer than expressing preference. Over the years, this becomes an internal rule. Make choices that keep the environment stable. The child grows older, but the rule stays active, shaping how decisions are made. In many homes, approval is quiet, but its absence is loud. A slight pause before responding, a neutral face held for a moment too long, a mild correction delivered at the wrong time. These experiences shape the child's sense of responsibility for the parent's mood. The developing mind assumes that stability depends on correct behavior, creating a pattern of vigilant emotional monitoring. By the time the child reaches adolescence, the pattern feels familiar, not forced. The focus remains on preventing disruption rather than understanding their own reactions. This early calibration becomes a template for adulthood, checking the emotional atmosphere before choosing an action. The fear of disappointing a parent is not about fear itself. It is about the old habit of preserving equilibrium. Certain adjustments continue long after the situation ends. What begins as watching a parent's reactions eventually becomes something you do even when no one is watching. The mind builds an internal observer that evaluates choices with the same logic you once used to avoid parental disappointment. This observer appears quietly. You feel it as a brief hesitation before making decisions that might be judged. You sense it when you rehearse explanations in your head, even if no one asked for them. It's the internal presence that comments on your actions the way a parent once did, anticipating criticism before any real feedback exists. Over time, this observer becomes efficient. It predicts what could trigger disapproval before the adult self has finished forming the thought. It steps in quickly, as if trying to prevent an outcome it learned to avoid years ago. The reaction is not dramatic. It's procedural, like running a script written long before you had autonomy. This internal mechanism doesn't rely on memory of specific moments. It relies on patterns, the tone that signaled irritation, the posture that signaled disappointment, the silence that signaled disapproval. These cues were repeated often enough that the brain stored their logic. Now the logic functions automatically. In adulthood, the observer is less about parents and more about the template they provided. It filters decisions through an old lens. Is this acceptable? Will this create tension? Should I minimize this? You feel the questions as sensations rather than thoughts. A slow tightening, a second guess, a need to justify. Even when your parents aren't involved, the observer remains active. You might avoid taking a risk because it feels too much. You might overexplain a boundary because it feels safer to preempt misunderstanding. The observer frames these actions as necessary precautions, even though the original source of pressure is no longer present. What lingers is not their judgment, but the internal version of it, shaped by years of anticipating their reactions. The fear of disappointing them persists because the observer continues evaluating your choices, as if their reaction still determines something fundamental. Some patterns activate faster than intention. Anticipating disappointment is one of them. The body prepares for impact long before anything actually happens, as if it has rehearsed the moment too many times to wait for confirmation. This anticipation isn't loud. It shows up as a subtle contraction in the chest, a controlled tone of voice, a careful choice of words. You sense yourself bracing, not for what is happening, but for what might happen. The possibility of disappointing a parent becomes more powerful than their actual reaction ever was. Over the years, the mind becomes skilled at imagining outcomes that match old experiences. Even neutral situations can trigger the expectation of judgment. A simple decision feels heavier. Sharing a preference feels risky. Asking for something feels like you're creating inconvenience. The anticipation shapes behavior before your adult reasoning has a chance to intervene. The cost is internal. Instead of choosing freely, you manage potential reactions. You minimize needs to avoid friction. You overexplain to prevent misinterpretation. You adjust yourself to reduce any chance of creating discomfort. These habits don't come from conscious fear. They come from the body treating possible disapproval as a threat. Anticipation then also distorts scale. Small choices feel significant. Minor deviations trigger worry. You sense the possibility of disappointing someone, even when they haven't expressed anything. The mind fills in the reaction automatically, using old patterns as a reference. The body reacts first. Logic follows later. It interprets uncertainty as danger, reminding you of the times when your stability depended on reading the emotional state of a parent. This creates a cycle where you respond to predicted disappointment rather than real events. What persists is not the original situation, but the readiness for it. The adult version of you may understand that the stakes are lower, yet the internal system reacts as if nothing has changed. The anticipation remains active, shaping choices in subtle but constant ways. Some standards settle into place before you realize you adopted them. The idea of what counts as enough often starts as a reflection of what kept things calm at home. A parent's definition of effort, success, or adequacy becomes the scale you use to measure yourself long after you stop needing their evaluation. This scale forms quietly. If approval appeared when you worked without complaint, You learned that rest signals weakness. If praise came only with high performance, you learned that average means failure. If neutrality felt like disappointment, you learned that consistency isn't sufficient. None of this is stated directly. It is absorbed through repetition. As you grow older, the scale becomes familiar, not questioned. You evaluate your actions through inherited criteria. Work harder, don't slow down, don't fall short. You sense an internal pressure to match a standard you didn't create, but still follow instinctively. These standards show up in daily decisions. You might overcommit because turning down responsibility feels like inviting judgment. You might continue working after exhaustion because stopping feels unsafe. You might measure achievements by imagined parental reactions rather than your own evaluation. The scale becomes the background metric for every task. Relationships are affected as well. You may assume others expect the same level of performance or self-denial. You might give more than you comfortably can because anything less feels inadequate. You carry the idea that approval must be earned, even when no one has asked you to earn it. The scale is persistent because it was formed during years when stability depended on alignment with parental expectations. Your body still reacts to the possibility of falling short, even if the situation is unrelated to them. The internal check, "Is this enough?" appears automatically, often before you recognize it. By adulthood, scale feels like part of your identity, even though it originated outside you. The fear of disappointing your parents continues because their early standards still define the threshold you use to determine whether you're doing well or failing. Some adjustments happen internally long before you speak. The loop of silent negotiation is one of them. It's the quiet process where you rehearse explanations, soften your tone, or rewrite your preferences to avoid creating the impression that you're causing disappointment. The negotiation begins automatically. You feel it as a pause before expressing something you want. You sense yourself checking whether the request sounds reasonable, whether the timing is inconvenient, whether the reaction might shift the atmosphere. None of this is spoken. It plays out entirely in your mind, shaped by years of managing parental expectations. You reduce the impact of your needs by presenting them in smaller versions. You phrase your thoughts carefully. You monitor how much space you take up, even if the situation has nothing to do with your parents. The old instinct to keep things stable guides the way you communicate. This loop doesn't require pressure from anyone else. It activates simply because expressing yourself still feels like a potential disruption. You try to preempt reactions that may never come, using strategies learned in childhood. Minimize, soften, adjust. These habits worked when the goal was avoiding tension with a parent. In adulthood, they continue because the system never learned to stand down. The negotiation also shapes how you handle conflict. You might prepare multiple versions of what you want to say, anticipating objections that haven't been voiced. You might apologize before explaining, as if you're already responsible for possible discomfort. You might agree to something you don't prefer because the idea of creating disappointment feels heavier than the consequences of compliance. None of this appears dramatic from the outside. It feels practical, almost logical, but internally it reflects an ongoing attempt to stay aligned with a standard of behavior that once protected your connection to a parent. The negotiation continues because the body still believes misalignment carries a cost. The fear of disappointing them persists in these micro-adjustments, the constant recalculation of tone, timing, and wording. Even in moments where no disappointment is possible, the loop keeps running, trying to maintain a balance that belonged to another time. Some conflicts operate beneath deliberate choice. The tension between wanting autonomy and wanting parental acceptance is one of them. Both impulses activate at the same time, pulling in different directions without needing a conscious decision. Autonomy appears as a quiet urge to choose freely. It shows up in moments when you imagine a different path, a different priority, or a different pace. The desire is clear, but so is the internal signal that independence might disrupt something important. Attachment appears automatically. It carries the old logic that staying aligned keeps the connection intact. Even as an adult, the body holds onto the idea that approval maintains closeness and deviation risks distance. The conflict doesn't come from dependency. It comes from the long-standing association between compliance and emotional safety. These two forces overlap in daily situations. You may hesitate to pursue something meaningful because it contradicts what your parents value. You may downplay achievements because they don't fit their expectations. You may feel guilty for wanting something entirely your own. The reactions aren't exaggerated. They're remnants of early relational patterns. The internal split creates mixed signals. Part of you leans toward independence, imagining choices based on your own criteria. Another part braces for the possibility of disappointing the people who shaped your earliest sense of security. The body interprets this as risk even when nothing external is at stake. This conflict is often silent. You might not discuss it because it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like an invisible negotiation between two old priorities: self-direction and emotional continuity. The adult self understands the difference, but the deeper system responds as if both must coexist without friction. What remains is a patterned caution. You approach decisions with a balance of desire and restraint, carrying the weight of both impulses. The fear of disappointing your parents persists because it sits at the intersection of autonomy and attachment, two needs that develop together and never fully separated. Some realizations arrive quietly. The patterns that formed around your parents' reactions didn't disappear. They shifted inward and continued guiding you. The tension you feel in certain decisions isn't confusion. It's the old system checking for stability before you move. These reactions don't ask whether the context has changed. They only follow the rules they learned first. As you notice these internal shifts, you begin to see how many of them still echo early expectations. The question that remains is simple: which reaction shows up first for you?